He moved his bride into my home and treated me like unwanted furniture, erasing my life to fit her vibe. They thought I was a pushover, but I sold the house on their wedding day and delivered the bill mid-toast. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. He said I was too old to live alone, then moved his new bride into my home like I was already gone. They redecorated my life, erased my memories, and laughed when I asked where my things went, treating me like I was just in the way. I didn't argue or beg, but I wrote everything down, and when their big day came, I was already 10 steps ahead. Before I begin, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is, because I need to know I am not alone in this. This kind of cruelty furs in families behind closed doors, a quiet sickness that your support can help shine a light on. I was folding towels when the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, warming my hands on a Thursday laundry day. It was a simple rhythm in a life I built carefully, piece by piece, like the quilt on my bed. Then Marcus called, his voice carrying a thin wire of desperation. I hadn't heard since he was 15, and coming home with a busted lip. "Ma," he said, his voice crackling like he was calling from a long way off. "I need somewhere to crash just for a little while. The divorce is official now." My heart did a little squeeze at the unraveling of the life he tried to build with a woman I never quite warmed to, even though I'd baked my best pound cake for her bridal shower. I told him yes, before the words were fully out of his mouth. "Of course, baby. You come on home." That's what mothers do. We open the door even when we see the storm clouds gathering. He showed up that evening as dusk settled like a soft gray blanket over the neighborhood. 2 worn duffel bags dropped with a thud by the doorway, and the defeated look in his eyes was a punch to my gut. He looked older than 38, tired down to the bone, mumbling about a week in a cheap motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. I believed him, the faint scent of it clinging to his clothes as I bustled to make him sweet tea with extra lemon. I went to the linen closet for the good lavender sheets and headed to the kitchen to cook smothered pork chops with Vidalia onions over fluffy white rice. Comfort food, soul food, the kind of meal meant to heal. But Marcus barely touched it, pushing the food around his plate before retreating to the guest room with a soft click of the door. I told myself to give him time because grief has its own schedule. For the first few weeks, an uneasy calm settled over my condo, with Marcus being helpful, carrying heavy groceries and fixing the leaky kitchen faucet. He even mowed the small patch of lawn, the whir of the mower, a surprisingly comforting sound on a Saturday morning. One Sunday, he even came with me to early service at Greater Hope Baptist, shocking the congregation into a flurry of hushed whispers. He told Pastor Evans and Sister Agnes he was just regrouping while looking for long-term arrangements. I stood beside him, patting his arm, wanting to believe my child would find his way back to solid ground. Then came Kenya. Her arrival wasn't announced with a knock. It was insidious, like a vine creeping through a garden. A vibrant fuchsia silk scarf appeared over the bathroom hook, its perfume clashing with my ivory soap. An extra black toothbrush materialized next to mine, and a tube of cherry red lip gloss showed up nestled among my sterling silver spoons. I asked Marcus about it one evening, and he just gave that sheepish grin he used at 10 when caught sneaking cookies. "Oh, that's Kenya," he said, rubbing his neck. "She's someone new and special." I wondered how serious it could be if I, the one whose roof he was under, was the last to know. A week later, Kenya was in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, scrambling eggs in my cast iron skillet and wearing my favorite quilted house slippers. She hadn't asked, just moved with a confidence that set my teeth on edge. Kenya was beautiful, light-skinned with glossy dark hair and flawless makeup even at 8 in the morning. but her eyes had a cool, calculating glint, like a January wind. She didn't say thank you for the coffee or ask to use my stove. She just moved through my space like she belonged there more than I did, assessing me and finding me wanting. The real shift happened a month later when I walked into my living room to find it alien. My antique quilt, hand-stitched by my grandmother, was gone from the sofa. The big armchair where I'd nursed Marcus and where my late husband Charles used to read the paper had been replaced by a stiff teal velvet thing with spindly gold legs. Gold accented pillows shed glitter everywhere in my sanctuary. I stood frozen, my book club bag slipping from my numb fingers. Kenya, lounging on the velvet monstrosity with my good crystal wine glass, didn't even look up. "Oh, hey, Odessa," she said. "We're just freshening it up because it felt so old and dated in here." I turned to Marcus, who was hovering in the hallway, fiddling with a loose thread on his shirt. "Marcus," I said, "this is my home." He rubbed his neck and told me not to be like that, saying I always wanted to pass the place to him anyway. They were making it more livable for his future, not mine. That night I lay awake, watching the ceiling fan and thinking of the decades of life this condo had seen, from Marcus's first steps to the quiet days after Charles passed. It was a repository of my life, but I was being treated like an unwelcome guest. I bit my tongue when Kenya burned cornbread and blamed my oven, and I stayed silent when I overheard her telling friends I was just a bitter, bored old person. She even held up my arthritis gloves like they were medieval torture devices and laughed. But silence has its limits. 2 weeks later, the dam broke when Kenya threw a Saturday brunch without consulting me. I woke late to find my home transformed into a bustling cafe full of strangers in bright dresses drinking mimosas from my champagne flutes. They were snapping selfies on my floral couch while Kenya looked at me with annoyance, waving a dismissive hand as if I were the hired help. Marcus just gave me a sheepish shrug and mouthed the word later. I went back to my room and locked the door, my hands trembling. This was erasure. That night, I called Renee Claiborne, a real estate attorney, and my friend since before Marcus was born. I told her how Kenya moved in like a squatter and how my things were disappearing. Renee asked if I still had the deed. I found it in a faded manila folder, Odessa Johnson. My name. Only mine. Charles had insisted on it for my security. The following Sunday, I smiled through another brunch, listening to Kenya brag about her high-end wedding and a brand new chapter for them. Later, I asked Marcus how long they planned to stay. He casually said until after the wedding to save money for a honeymoon in Bora Bora. I just nodded, a frozen tundra of fury on the inside. Something inside me sharpened into a weapon. The next morning, Renee told me I had all the power, and we started by giving them a formal 30-day legal notice to vacate. We sent it by certified mail. I was on the porch when the mailman delivered it. I watched Kenya laugh, calling me crazy, but Marcus looked bewildered. "Just protecting my space, son," I said, sipping my coffee. The home became suffocating. Kenya stopped speaking to me, slamming doors and coughing whenever I entered. Marcus moped, shooting me wounded looks I ignored. I started packing the things that held my soul: photo albums, silver cufflinks, my mother's Bible. Renee helped me find a discreet buyer and set the closing date for March 11th, the very day of their wedding. Kenya, arrogant as ever, used my address for the florist, the caterer, and the rental company for the gold chairs. They thought I was a relic, forgetting I'd raised Marcus, buried my husband, and paid off a 30-year mortgage by myself. One morning, I woke to the scent of industrial bleach. Kenya was scrubbing the floor in my favorite pajama pants. She'd rearranged my kitchen, putting sugar in the salt jar and flour in the coffee bin. My system was annihilated. When I reached for a mug, Marcus made me in second grade. She smiled an artificial smile and said she moved them to a lower shelf so they were easier for me to reach. Easier meant older and weaker. Over the next week, she brought home garish vases and hung an ugly brass mirror where my family photos used to be. She said the pictures of my grandchildren clashed with her vibe. When I asked Marcus why he didn't stand up for my memories, he just sighed and said she was making it feel like home. I found my mother's antique sewing basket in the outdoor trash bin that night. I didn't scream. I photographed it and emailed it to Renee as Exhibit A. Renee told me I didn't owe them kindness anymore because they were colonizing my life. The 30-day notice expired, and they stayed, assuming it was a bluff. Kenya told Marcus I was just scared of dying alone. That's when I hardened into a block of pure ice. Vendors traipsed in and out for the wedding, while I wrote down every insult in a brown folder. Kenya called me a temporary placeholder on the phone. A few days later, she stood in front of my TV and told me I needed to leave for the wedding weekend so she could have the space for bridal prep. I should stay with a friend or get a hotel, she said. Not for long, sweetie, she laughed when I said it was my home. I met the buyers, Andre and Patrice, at a coffee shop. They were a kind young couple, ready to close on March 11th. Everything was legal and clean. Renee sent one final reminder by courier, stating their belongings would be moved to storage if not gone by March 10th. They signed and ignored it. Kenya kept giving virtual tours of the condo on her phone, planning where to put a wet bar after the honeymoon. I scheduled the movers, the cleaners, and the locksmith. On the morning of the 10th, Travis and Deshan arrived to move my things to my new modest apartment. I had them pack Marcus and Kenya's things into a climate-controlled storage unit, meticulously labeling every box. I took photos of everything. They were at a spa day, posting videos of champagne glasses. By noon, the condo was empty and peaceful. A cleaning crew scrubbed every surface until it smelled of lemons. That evening, Renee and I practiced my lines for the reception. I had my navy blue gown ready, simple and regal. Legendary Odessa, Renee said. I slept dreamlessly that night. On the morning of the wedding, I met the buyers and signed the papers. I handed over the keys at 10:47 a.m. The condo was no longer mine. That afternoon, Kenya and her bridal party descended on the sold property with hairdryers and photographers, filming TikToks in a place that didn't belong to them. I sat at Renee's, watching it all on Instagram. At 5 p.m., we pulled up to the banquet hall. The bass was thumping. Kenya's voice echoed from inside. They were cutting the cake. I stepped out of the car, smoothing my gown. The fabric was heavy, and my mother's pearls were cool against my skin. I walked into the hall, and heads turned. The music faltered. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the floor. Some people gasped, but the matriarchs just nodded. I reached the head table and stood before Marcus and Kenya. She asked what I was doing there, saying I wasn't invited. I didn't look at her. I looked at my son and placed a thick white envelope between their champagne glasses. I told the room that since they used my address for everything, I'd forwarded the bills for the caterer, florist, and the cleaning crew. Then I told them I sold the condo that morning and handed over the keys. It was no longer their home. A deafening hush fell. A fork clattered. Kenya's face cracked as she screamed that the place was supposed to be hers. It was mine, I said, until this morning. Marcus panicked, but I just smiled at the crowd and told them to enjoy the cake because they'd paid for it. Then I walked out. As I reached the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall, the silence behind me began to shatter into 100 different shards of noise. I didn't need to see the fallout to feel the heat of it. The cool evening air hit my face like a benediction, and I felt the weight of decades lifting off my shoulders. Renee was already in the driver's seat. the car idling with a low, steady hum that felt like a heartbeat. She didn't say a word as I climbed in. She just reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with a fierce, quiet pride. We pulled away from the curb, just as the first guests began to spill out onto the sidewalk, their faces tight with the kind of shock that only comes from a public execution of a lie. I looked at my hands in my lap. They were steady. No more trembling, no more reaching for things that weren't there. I had built a life, and I had protected the ending of it. The drive to my new apartment was short, but it felt like traveling across an ocean. When we arrived, the building was quiet, the hallway smelling of fresh paint and nothing else. I walked into my new living room and didn't turn on the lights. The city skyline was enough, a grid of flickering stars that didn't care about my family's drama. I sat in my chair, the one with the history Kenya couldn't erase, and let the silence wrap around me. My phone buzzed on the counter, a persistent, angry insect. I let it die. I didn't need to hear the vitriol or the excuses. I had spoken my truth in the only language Marcus and Kenya understood, the language of ownership and consequence. By the next morning, the digital world had caught up. Renee called me at dawn, her voice thick with laughter. "Odessa," she said, "you're a viral sensation." Someone had filmed the whole thing, the moment the envelope hit the table, the moment Kenya's tiara seemed to tilt on her head. I scrolled through the comments, seeing the world divide into those who thought I was a monster and those who recognized a mother reclaiming her soul. One comment stood out, written by a woman I'd never meet. "Justice isn't always quiet. Sometimes it has to be loud enough to wake the dead." I spent the day unpacking, placing my grandmother's quilt on my new bed, and lining up my silver spoons in a drawer that stayed exactly where I put it. There was a peace in the order of things. But the silence from Marcus didn't last. On Tuesday, the knocks came. 3 soft, hesitant taps that sounded like a child asking for a glass of water in the middle of the night. I looked through the peephole and saw him, my son, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, stripped of the tuxedo and the bravado. I opened the door, but didn't move from the threshold. He told me Kenya was gone, that she'd left him at the hotel, calling him a mama's boy who couldn't protect their future. He said he was sorry for everything, for the furniture, for the erasure, for the glitter. I listened to his voice break, looking for the boy I'd raised, and finding only the man who had let me be treated like a placeholder. I told him that when you treat your mother like unwanted furniture, you shouldn't be surprised when she moves herself. He asked if we could get coffee sometime, a plea for a bridge I wasn't ready to build yet. I told him we'd see, and closed the door with a quiet final click. I walked to my window and watched him walk to his car, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own choices. I didn't feel joy in his pain, only a profound sense of completion. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat back down, picking up the brown folder labeled "When They Forget Who I Am." I looked at the notes, the photos of the trash, the records of the insults. It was a map of a war I hadn't asked for but had been forced to win. With a slow, deliberate motion, I began to tear the pages. I tore them until the floor was covered in white scraps, a blizzard of old hurts that no longer had any power over me. I remembered who I was. I was Odessa Johnson, and I was finally, for the first time in a long time, completely at home. The first week in the new apartment felt like a slow exhale after a lifelong breath held underwater. I spent the mornings watching the sun crawl across the floorboards, a simple pleasure that Kenya's gold-accented chaos had stolen from me. The building was filled with the muffled sounds of other lives, a piano practicing down the hall, the rhythmic thump of a dryer. But they were background noise, not intrusions. I started a small herb garden on the balcony, my fingers stained with rich, dark earth as I planted basil and rosemary. Renee visited often, bringing over containers of takeout and the latest updates on the social fallout. The church was divided, she told me over a plate of spicy noodles. Some of the younger couples thought I was cold, but the elders, the ones who'd buried husbands and watched children drift away, were calling me a queen. I just laughed. I didn't do it to be a queen, I said. I did it to be a person again. We talked about the storage unit, which Marcus still hadn't touched. The 60-day clock was ticking, a silent countdown to a final disposal. I didn't call him. I didn't check on him. I knew from the grapevine that he was staying on a friend's couch, his bank account drained by the wedding expenses and the honeymoon Bora Bora tickets that Kenya had kept for herself. It was a harsh winter for him, but I knew that some seeds only sprout after a deep freeze. I focused on my own life, reconnecting with the book club and hosting small dinners where the cornbread never burned, and the conversations were never about vibes or photo shoots. One evening, I found a small box at my door. No note, just a gift-wrapped square. Inside was a chipped yellow mug, the one Marcus had made me in 2nd grade. He must have retrieved it from the storage unit before it was locked tight. I held it in my hands, feeling the uneven clay and the weight of the memory. It was a peace offering, a small piece of the boy I used to know. I didn't call him, but I put the mug on the top shelf of my cabinet, where I could reach it whenever I wanted. The city began to bloom into spring, the air smelling of jasmine and old rain. I walked to the park most afternoons, watching the children play and the old men move their chess pieces with slow, deliberate grace. I felt a lightness in my step. I hadn't felt since Charles was alive. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in the quiet space I had carved out for myself. My name was on the lease. My name was on the bank account, and my name was spoken with respect by those who truly knew me. I received a letter from Andre and Patrice, the young couple who bought the condo. They sent a photo of the living room, now filled with books and a soft, oversized sofa. They said the house felt like it had a good soul, and they were taking care of the oak tree in the back. I smiled, happy that the walls were finally echoing with kindness again. I had passed the torch, not because I was forced to, but because it was time. I was no longer a ghost in my own history. I was the author of my own future. By the 2nd month, the relentless buzzing of my phone had finally settled into a manageable hum. The cousins and the strangers had moved on to the next viral scandal, leaving me in the sanctuary of my own making. I began volunteering at the community center, teaching a sewing class to young girls who looked at my mother's silver thimble with wonder. I told them stories while we worked, not about betrayal, but about the strength in every stitch. I taught them that a quilt is only as strong as the thread that holds it together. Renee called me one afternoon with a different tone in her voice. Marcus had reached out to her, asking for my address again. He wanted to deliver the rest of the storage unit keys because he couldn't afford the fees anymore. I told her to have him leave them at her office. I wasn't ready for him to see my space, my peace. I knew that if I let him in too soon, the shadows of the condo would follow him through the door. I needed my walls to stay clean for a little while longer. I went to Renee's office to pick up the keys. She handed them to me in a small envelope. Her expression softened. "He looks different, Odessa," she said. "He looks like he's finally growing up, though it's a late start." I tucked the keys into my purse and nodded. "Growth is painful," I told her. I spent that weekend at the storage facility, sorting through the remnants of the life they tried to build on my foundation. I saw the teal velvet chair, now dusty and looking cheap under the harsh fluorescent lights. I saw the boxes of Kenya's shoes, the glittery pillows, and the gold-framed mirror that had once replaced my family photos. I didn't feel anger looking at them, only a strange kind of pity. They had chased a vibe and caught a ghost. I arranged for the furniture to be donated to a women's shelter, thinking that maybe someone who actually needed a chair wouldn't care if it was dated or not. I kept nothing of theirs. When the unit was empty, I handed the keys back to the manager and walked away without looking back. The sun was setting as I drove home, casting a long golden light over the city. I thought about the bridge Marcus was trying to build. It was a fragile thing, made of chipped mugs and hesitant knocks, but it was there. I realized that while I had reclaimed my dignity, I hadn't lost my heart. I was a mother, and that was a part of me that no amount of betrayal could fully erase. I just had to decide what kind of mother I wanted to be in this new chapter. I arrived home and made a list. Not a list of grievances this time, but a list of boundaries. I wrote down what I would accept and what I would never tolerate again. I realized that my peace wasn't just about the walls around me, but about the people I let through the door. I was the gatekeeper now. I felt a profound sense of power in that realization. I wasn't waiting for an apology to be okay. I was already okay. The apology was just for him. On the 3-month anniversary of the wedding, I did something I hadn't expected to do. I called Marcus. I didn't invite him over, and I didn't offer a clean slate, but I asked him to meet me at the park, the neutral ground where the old men played chess. He was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench with his head down. When he saw me, he stood up quickly, a flicker of hope and fear crossing his face. We walked the perimeter of the pond in silence for a long time, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our shoes. He told me he'd found a steady job and a small room in a quiet house. He said he was going to church again, not to shock the congregation, but to find a way to live with himself. He didn't ask for money, and he didn't ask to move back in. He just asked if he could call me once a week. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man he might become if he kept walking this path. I told him he could call, but that the phone worked both ways, and I wouldn't be the one chasing him. We reached the end of the path, and he stopped, looking at me with eyes that were clear for the first time in years. "Ma," he said, "thank you for not letting me win." I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. If I had let him stay, if I had let them erase me, he would have stayed a boy forever, hiding behind Kenya silk scarves. By standing up for myself, I had forced him to stand up for himself. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done as a mother, but it was the most important. I watched him walk away toward the parking lot, and I didn't feel the need to follow him. I walked back to my own car, my own apartment, my own life. I thought about the brown folder I'd torn into scraps. I didn't need the evidence anymore because the truth was written in the way I carried myself. I was Odessa Johnson, a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to protect it. The resurrection Sister Joy had toasted to wasn't just a story. It was my reality. That night, I sat on my balcony and watched the stars. I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace that no glitter or teal velvet could ever touch. I was whole, I was free, and I was finally home. I realized that the best revenge wasn't the public exposure or the forwarded bills. It was the life I was living now. It was the fact that I could look in the mirror and see a woman who had fought for her dignity and won. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of rosemary and old rain, and I smiled. The quiet of my new life was a solid thing, but the world has a way of testing a person's peace just when they think they have mastered it. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, one that bypassed my filters because it was listed as a local medical office. I answered, my heart giving a small, instinctive thud against my ribs. It was a social worker from the county hospital, They had a man in the recovery ward who had been involved in a multi-car pileup on the interstate. He had no ID on him, only a crumpled, half-torn receipt from a storage facility with my name and old address on the back. I felt the air thin in my lungs as I drove to the hospital. I told myself it was just a formality, a lingering thread from the life I had already cut away. But when I walked into the room, it wasn't Marcus in the bed. It was Kenya. She looked nothing like the polished porcelain creature who had scrambled eggs in my kitchen. Her dark hair was a matted mess. Her face was bruised the color of a late summer plum, and one arm was encased in heavy white plaster. She looked small, broken, and terrifyingly human. When she saw me, she didn't sneer or laugh. She started to cry, a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the sterile silence of the room. She told me she had nowhere else to go. After she left Marcus, she had tried to move back in with her sister, but the bridge there had been burned years ago over money. She had been living out of her car, the one she'd used to haul away her shopping bags and teal pillows. The accident had taken the car and everything inside it. She was homeless, broke, and the hospital was ready to discharge her to a shelter. I stood at the foot of her bed, my hands tucked into the pockets of my navy coat. I thought about the sewing basket in the trash. I thought about the way she waving her hand at me like I was the help. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I only felt a heavy, cold exhaustion. Kenya reached out her good hand, her fingers trembling. "Odessa, please," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it. I know what I did." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see an antagonist. I saw the consequence of a life built on sand. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You're right," I said. "You don't deserve it. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I refuse to let your shadow turn me into someone I'm not." I didn't take her to my apartment. I didn't let her anywhere near my peace. Instead, I called Renee. Within an hour, we had her placed in a temporary convalescent home run by the church, a place with strict rules and no room for vibes. I paid for the first month's stay using the small profit I'd kept from the furniture sale. It was a clean transaction, a final act of mercy that carried no obligation. As I walked out of the hospital, I felt a different kind of strength. I hadn't just protected my home, I had protected my grace. I was still the gatekeeper, but I knew when to open the door just wide enough to let the light in without letting the storm back through. The news of Kenya's accident filtered through the family like a slow-moving fever. Marcus called me that evening, his voice a frantic jumble of guilt and confusion. He wanted to know if he should go to her, if he should try to fix what was clearly beyond repair. I sat in my kitchen, the yellow mug in my hand, and let him talk until the words ran dry. "Marcus," I said, "you can't heal someone who used you as a ladder. You can only decide if you're going to keep being the rungs." He was silent for a long time, the kind of silence where a man finally looks at his own reflection and doesn't look away. He didn't go to her. He stayed in his small room, working his double shifts and sending me photos of the books he was reading. He was learning that some things, once broken, are better left as lessons. Meanwhile, at the convalescent home, Kenya was discovering that luxury is a poor substitute for character. Sister Joy visited her, not to judge, but to offer a Bible and a set of knitting needles. She told me Kenya was quiet now, the arrogance replaced by a hollow, watchful look. She was realizing that the world didn't owe her a stage, and that the only thing she truly owned was the choices she made when no one was watching. The 60-day deadline for the storage unit arrived. I went one last time to ensure everything was cleared. The facility manager handed me a small envelope that had been found wedged behind a crate of Marcus's old trophies. It was a letter Charles had written to Marcus, one he'd intended to give him on his wedding day, but had tucked away and forgotten as his health failed. I sat in my car and read it, my vision blurring. Charles had written about the weight of a name, about how a home isn't a building, but the way you treat the people inside it. He'd warned Marcus that a man who doesn't respect his foundations will eventually find himself sleeping in the dirt. I realized then that Charles had seen the cracks in Marcus long before I had. He had tried to plant the seeds of honor, but they had been choked out by the weeds of entitlement. I drove to the park and met Marcus. I didn't say anything. I just handed him the letter. I watched his face as he read his father's words, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes filled. He didn't say thank you. He just folded the paper carefully and put it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. We walked the path one more time, and for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows over the pond, Marcus turned to me. "I'm going to pay you back, Ma," he said, "for the bills, for the storage, for everything." I looked at him and saw the flicker of the man Charles wanted him to be. "I don't want the money, Marcus," I told him. "I want you to be the kind of man who would never have sent those bills in the first place." He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. I stayed on the bench long after he left, watching the first stars appear. I realized that my restoration was complete. I hadn't just saved my home. I had saved my son's soul by letting it break. The final transition of the year came with the first frost, turning the grass into a sea of silver needles. My apartment was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon and the soft light of a single lamp. I had become a fixture in my new neighborhood, the woman who knew everyone's name and always had a spare key for the neighbors. My life was small, but it was deep. I had learned that the most powerful thing a person can do is say no to a lie and yes to the truth, no matter how much it hurts. The viral video had faded into the archives of the internet, a digital ghost of a woman who had once been pushed too far. Kenya finished her time at the church home and moved to a different city to live with a distant aunt who needed a caregiver. It was a fitting turn of karma. The woman who had tried to erase an elder was now responsible for the care of one. Sister Joy said she left without a word, taking only her knitting needles and a single photo of herself from the wedding day, one where she wasn't looking at the camera. I hope she found whatever it was she was actually looking for in the gold and the glitter. Some people have to lose everything to realize they never had anything to begin with. Marcus came over for dinner on a Sunday. It was the first time I had let him into my new space. He walked through the door and stopped, his eyes roaming over the quilt, the silver spoons, and the family photos that now hung with pride on the walls. He didn't try to change anything. He didn't offer any suggestions. He just sat at the table and ate the smothered pork chops I had made, his movements slow and respectful. We talked about his job, about the letter from Charles, and about the future. It wasn't the easy, blind love of the past. It was a new, tempered thing, forged in the fire of consequence. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked at the brown accordion folder sitting on the bookshelf. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "That's it," I said. He reached out and touched the label, his fingers lingering on the words, "When they forget who I am." "I'm never going to forget again, Ma," he promised. I watched him walk down the hallway, and I didn't feel the need to lock the door immediately. I knew he was carrying the weight of his own growth now. I sat back down in my chair and looked at my home. It was mine, in every sense of the word. I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the moment I placed the envelope on the table. It was the moment I realized I didn't need the anger anymore. The anger had been the fuel that got me to the new shore, but now that I was here, I could let it go. I was Odessa Johnson, and I was at peace. I picked up the yellow mug, the one with the chipped handle and took a sip of tea. It was warm. It was real. And it was enough. The chapter that began with a betrayal had ended with a resurrection, and the book was finally ready to be closed. The morning of the 1-year anniversary of the sale arrived with a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted with a steady hand. I woke up and didn't think about the condo. I didn't think about the gold chairs or the scent of industrial bleach. I thought about the breakfast I was going to have with Renee and the new quilt I was starting for my youngest grandchild. I walked through my apartment, my feet knowing every board and every turn. There was a rhythm to my days now, a music that belonged only to me. I was no longer a ghost. I was the heartbeat of my own world. I met Renee at the Daily Grind, the same corner booth where we had planned the reckoning. She looked at me and smiled, her eyes sharp as ever. "You look younger, Odessa," she said. "I feel lighter," I told her. We talked about the year, about the twists and the turns, and about the sheer audacity of it all. We laughed about the viral video, which had finally been buried under a mountain of newer, louder scandals. It was just a story now, a piece of folklore in the history of Greater Hope Baptist. We had won, not just the legal battle, but the war for my dignity. On my way home, I drove past the old condo complex. I didn't stop, but I slowed down just enough to see the oak tree in the back. It was full and green, its branches reaching toward the sun. I saw a child's bicycle on the porch and a set of wind chimes hanging from the eaves. It looked like a home again, a place where memories were being built instead of erased. I felt a surge of genuine happiness for Andre and Patrice. I had given them a foundation, and they were building something beautiful on it. I turned the corner and headed toward my own street. When I got back to my apartment, there was a small plant on my doorstep, a jasmine vine, just like the one Marcus and I had talked about in the park. There was a card tucked into the leaves. "For the new garden. Love, Marcus." I carried it inside and placed it on the balcony, right next to the rosemary. I sat in my armchair and let the afternoon sun warm my hands. I thought about the long road I had traveled, from the kitchen window, where I had folded towels a year ago, to this moment of absolute, earned peace. I picked up the small silver thimble and held it in my palm. It was a tiny thing, but it represented everything I had fought for: the history, the family, and the right to exist in my own life. I realized that when people forget who you are, the only thing that matters is that you remember. I had remembered, and in doing so, I had forced the world to see me. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the wind chimes on the balcony, a soft silver music that sang of home. I was Odessa Johnson, and I was finally, truly, and forever, more than enough. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.